When I first joined Weyerhaeuser back in the 1970s, in fact, I could have said something like Gene. Back then, forest products was very important in the state of Washington. Right now, what's important in the state of Washington is Amazon. I don't know if you guys have been tracking Amazon's growth, but they've been growing 37% a year. They have over 200,000 employees right now. I did a calculation the other day. The rate that Amazon's growing by the year 2030, all retail sales will go through Amazon, if you extrapolate that forever. So what I'm going to do today is, okay, for today we're going to go through a variety of different topics. I want to first take you through what was sort of Tim had asked for a little cover note in the outline. I said it's important you understand just the character, and we'll hit this in several different ways. The South really does sit in a very unique position compared to any other forested geography to look at both the scope of both softwood and hardwood opportunities, but some of these international opportunities that are coming our way. And I'm coming from the Northwest, where I spent a lot of my focus, and then later spent a lot of time in the South as well. It is a very unique area. In terms of my own background, not only have I been with Weyerhaeuser for 37 years, but I did want to mention that I've also had the opportunity to be with the company, back with the company when it was a much bigger company. I don't know if you've tracked the history of Weyerhaeuser, but at its peak it had about 64,000 employees, covered the full forest products industry and had a range of international activities. I think now as a REIT, Weyerhaeuser has about 13,000 employees. So it's shrunk considerably. It's no longer in the pulp paper businesses. It just exited that recently. But in my experience, for a period, I ran the particle board MDF business for several years back in the early 80s. I was called into a room by, I'm only using this to remind people of some of the challenges when you get in international markets and sales. Sometimes it's very easy for us just to do what's in the local economy rather than think about what the international market is. So the senior manager decided he wanted to call us all in, and this time he wanted to expand our sales to Japan. And so had me and the lumber manager, the plywood manager, and me running the particle board, and he wanted a sales growth plan for Japan. And all the other guys talked about their big plans, big growth. And I told Charlie, I said, I don't think exports make any sense for particle. We're $50 off the market in Japan. And he looked at me and said, that's the wrong answer. Go back and study the market some more. So anyway, I took a trip to Japan, spent 2 weeks in Japan. I came back, learned a lot, came back and found out, first of all, we had the wrong press sizes. The Japanese market was 1 meter by 2 meter. Our press sizes were 4 foot and 5 foot. So you don't get good yields out of your mat to go to that market. The other problem was the Japanese were using German technology for fasteners, so the density profile of our board just didn't make any sense in Japan. Third, they wanted quick shipment. They wanted immediate, they wanted day shipments. So you needed some wholesaling distribution to be effective, so we would have to set the distribution center there, which didn't make any sense. But the most important thing, after taking him through 50 slides, was basically I get $50 a thousand less in Japan than I get in my domestic market. So it made no sense for me to ship particle board to Japan with all the extra packaging. Having said that, we still did pick up some sales in Japan to the speaker manufacturers Yamaha. And so there were select markets that we did find were very profitable, would be good. Other things that I were involved in, as you know, Weyerhaeuser went into Uruguay, where our chief financial officer at the time called Uruguay the field of dreams. We were going to plant the trees and we hoped the market would come, because there really was no market. And I spent some time looking at what we do with eucalyptus and some of the loblolly in Uruguay, and it also required a different perception about timber value. When you're in the United States, you get a sort of backwards view of timber value. We tend to be a net deficit country, so on softwood we have to import wood primarily from Canada, but also from Europe and some other countries. So we have rent bid into timber. So we seem to have this belief that timber just has some inherent value. That value is derived from the market, but what nets out less the cost of delivering to the market. The problem when you go to a place like Uruguay is you're at the tail end of the supply chain. Now timber values become a little bit more challenging to figure out, because you've not only got to manufacture, haul to port, and then net out freight, and then you can determine what you might get for timber. So, by the way, there is now a rumor that Weyerhaeuser is to sell it your way. Operations didn't turn out to be that good. Probably my favorite story is the one time we were looking at doing a 250,000 acre deal in Russia, Vladivostok. And I got a phone call on Friday night from a guy that was doing the work. This was, by the way, when Gorbachev was coming into office. There was no clear idea what Russia would be like. And I get this phone call from this Gwen Lloyd. He says, Lynn, we're doing the final numbers on our acquisition for the Russian Vladivostok lands, and we need a ruble forecast. And I paused and started to giggle, and I said, Gwen, if you need a ruble forecast, let's not do the deal, okay? Because there's too much uncertainty. And we'll come back to the ruble because that's actually one of the interesting problems we're facing right now on the international side, is where the ruble exchange rate is and what it's doing to some values in some of our key markets. So, and then with the last one, I'll come back to the last one because, as Tom was mentioning, one of the other unique aspects of the U.S. South is the scope and range of the containerboard industry and your ability to provide virgin fiber. One of the things that's happened in the world is most of the containerboard packaging growth, for instance, in China, is based on recycled containerboards. They buy our recycle, they buy our, and then they use that for their manufacturing. They have no fiber themselves. The problem in the containerboard industry, some of you may or may not know, you can only run those boxes through the recycle process so many times. You still need virgin fiber at some point in time to get the strength that's required in boxes. And the U.S. South tends to be the primary provider for that virgin fiber for that global containerboard system. So again, that's an international perspective that you may or may not have. So I'm not going to say international opportunities are important. They will provide breadth. They also give you other alternatives to being dependent just on the domestic market. The problem is they tend to be more difficult to do, so a lot of people don't do it. I know that in listening to the fellow that put together the Klausner mill, one of the reasons they've taken the link technology at the Klausner mill is so that they can vary the cutting thicknesses and whatnot more quickly to meet those international specifications, which is sometimes hard to do, moving from inches to metric. But we'll come back to some of that in a bit. So with that, let's go to what I want to do today. So let's first start, I'm going to start with kind of where are we in the international growth area. And then we're going to talk about, then I want to move to the current challenges in the international situation. Where's the world economy and the exchange rates? The exchange rates are a huge problem for us. Another problem that's emerging a lot, I don't know if you've been reading the press lately, but we're hearing it in our own campaign. There's a lot of pushback on free trade, global trade, in a variety of different ways. That's also can be a major problem for us because we see more barriers going up. And then, by the way, today is the day that I think the U.S. coalition launches its complaint against the Canadians to renew the softwood lumber agreement. I think today is the day that the coalition will file. It's October 16th. And then I think the competitive position of the U.S. South, and then I do want to end with the story that although there's some headwinds in the near term, you've got to keep your perspective strategically on some of the long-term opportunities and not get too concerned with some of the short-term issues that you might confront here. So with that, let's go to the global economy. First of all, FAO estimates there's going to be continuing growth of global need for forest over the next 15 years. In fact, with FAO's estimates of sawnwood is to grow another 30% over the next 15 years. And sawnwood, we're talking about lumber and logs. The panel demand, they've got even a more staggering number, about 56%. There we're talking about things like plywood, particle board, OSB, MDF. And those, of course, have different fiber requirements, more than pulpwood, it's got a sawn timber. And then paper and paperboard, containerboard, they're arguing that we're going to see about 50% growth. Most of the growth is in Asia. And it applies to all those categories. And that growth that they're talking about, when FAO does their numbers, they're not talking about just softwood, they're talking about softwood and hardwood growth combined. And we'll see that in a minute. When you look at the size and scope and where the southern timber asset goes, you can see the breadth of where it goes. I mean, this is the softwood growing stock. Now, this is for both saw timber and for pulpwood. And lumber is the predominant user of saw timber, and of course, pulp and paper are the predominant users of pulpwood and some of the residual variables. Plywood, you can see, pretty small user of the timber. Bioenergy and other are also fairly small in the overall picture. In terms of hardwoods, the picture looks somewhat similar. We'll come back to this one because even here, we'll come back to lumber is the predominant user, again, of your saw timber, and your fine papers are the primary user. Remember, when we get into this, in warehousing, we used to call it the white side and the dark side. The white side is the things like pen-coated free sheet, printing and writing papers, fluff pulp, and cellulosic uses. That's primarily used as hardwoods. If you get into the dark side, which is containerboard, that needs the fiber strength, that uses softwood. So you have two very different industries that require different kinds of pulpwood. And again, the South is in a unique position to feed both of those types of pulp and paper requirements. So with that, one of the things I was recently doing a project for a timber owner, and they were trying to look at some of their international. They wanted to talk more about it. All they were looking at investing in timberlands outside the United States, so they were looking at where market growth was. And I must admit, before I prepared this slide, I was very North American centric, because over most of my experience with Weyerhaeuser, we always focused on shipping product to the United States or North America, because it was the dominant forest products market. You can see back in 2000, 2005, the red bar is the softwood lumber used in North America. And you can see we were the dominant user. Europe came in second with the blue bar. But what's important to notice is what's happened over the last 15 years. Asia has grown to basically be almost on the same scale. Now, part of it is we've come down. We'll focus on that in a minute. But Asia now consumes about as much lumber as North America and Europe. And that's primarily China, obviously. But if you look at now, when you go and start looking at things like, where do you look at opportunities if you're looking at things from the point of view of Chile, New Zealand, some of the other suppliers, or even the West Coast, logs and lumber, it's China. And it's been Asia. It's been a dominant grower of the market. And we'll come back to that. I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. Europe has remained relatively stable. It's still a very large user, but of course the difference there, they're also a competitor. Europe has a very large forested area that produces a lot of their own products. So let's look at North America. Well, first of all, this is what happened in North America. On the left is the U.S. lumber demand. On the right is North America lumber demand. If you're doing overall industry analysis, you're focused more on the right side, which is North America lumber demand. That's really what drives price and operating rate. The first thing to notice, where the big drop in lumber demand is that red down on the bottom there, the residential uses of the United States. As some of you know, we went into a depression. We'll come back to this because we're in the recovery phase. That's the important part of the recovery. In fact, thinking of FAO reminds me of one of my first opportunities at Weyerhaeuser was to go give a speech at FAO back in the 1970s. And my speech was entitled, "The primary cyclic driver of lumber demand in the United States is residential." Residential accounts for 30% of the lumber demand, but it's historically accounted for 70 to 80% of the historic swing in demand is in the residential sector. And in that speech, I was talking about one of our major supplying regions was Canada. So we got into the question and answer session, and the hand went up. And the fellow said, I said, "This is not a question, Dr. Michaelis, this is a statement. Just want to remind you, Canada is not a supplying region of the United States. It is a separate country." So I'm trying to remember that ever since, that Canada is an independent nation. If you look at the right side, this is where exports become important. Back in 2005, when North American lumber demand was up around 76 billion board feet, net exports to the United States were effectively zero. We were importing about as much wood from Europe as we were exporting to other countries. Since 2009, with the weakness in the domestic market, you can see that red bar on the top is net exports have grown and have been a significant part of the recovery. This is also true, we'll see later, in terms of log exports. But basically, where they sit today is there's still a fairly significant, most of that is exports out of Canada, but you've had some growth and improvement in exports out of the U.S. South as well. Part of what's happening now, we'll come back to it, is the export position in Europe and China has been deteriorating for us. and it's pushing some of the Canadian lumber back into the U.S. market right now. On the hardwood lumber side, almost a similar story. If you look at grade lumber, and I'll show you that in a minute, in fact, if you see the picture of where hardwood lumber goes, in fact, I do quite a bit of work with the pallet industry. One of the primary users of hardwood lumber is pallets. I think Tom was mentioning in the packaging, we forget that pallets are a fairly important usage of wood, and that's primarily a hardwood usage, not too much on the softwood side. But when you look at grade lumber, which is the high end of the hardwood lumber market, right now about 46% of that goes export primarily to China. And of course, one of the issues there recently has been a bit of a fall off in some of the Chinese market as well. So China and international is very important to both softwood and hardwood lumbers. But let's look at the current challenges we face if we get into the international realm that we're sitting in today. The world economy is growing at a pathetically slow rate. And this has been true since the crisis of 2008. This is kind of a complex chart in a way, but it's fairly simple. The red bar is world growth. Historically, if world growth gets down to about 2%, that's considered a recession. That's historically a very slow rate of growth. Right now, industrialized growth, if you take US, Europe, and some of the major economies like Australia and some of the others, we're growing at less than 2%. Most of the growth that we're getting is in Asia. So that the world economy is still in stress. And of course, what's happening here, countries like Europe sitting there, and we'll come back to the contrast between the US and Europe, the US is actually in a relatively healthy position, and Europe is continuing to struggle with a variety of factors, and including zero to negative interest rates, still aggressive policy to try to stimulate growth, at a time in the United States, and we'll come back to that, is thinking about raising interest rates because we're fearful of overheating. Europe's still concerned about deflation and some other issues. And if we look at South America, for instance, South America, Brazil has been in recession. There's two countries in the world right now that are in recession. It's Russia and Brazil, and for different reasons, but both of these countries are sitting in recessions. Now again, these can affect both our markets, but it affects their ability to compete, because we're going to come back to, because of that slow growth, it's affecting exchange rates. If you look at US growth, now I know that there's some people in this particular time of our 4-year cycle that like to say that the United States is in terrible economic condition, but we really aren't. The U.S. economy is doing fairly well. We're growing probably about as well as we're going to grow over the next few decades. One of the things that's happened globally is a significant drop in productivity growth. Right now, we're only seeing about 0.5% productivity growth from our labor force, and with a labor force growth of about 1% a year, 1.5% to 2% economic growth is pretty good. And that's what the Federal Reserve believes, and that's one of the reasons why the Federal Reserve is likely to boost interest rates again in December. They're starting to be concerned that we're overheating. We're starting to see wage pressures and full employment in the United States. So, despite what we hear, the United States is actually doing fairly well, and as some people used to say, we're kind of the prettiest horse in the glue factory. Now, let's go over to Asia. And of course, here's where things get really complex. China, well, officially China's growing at about 6%. And for those of you that have done work in China, I did have, when I was doing the containerboard work, you learn you have to do some very creative things on official data in China versus other ways. It appears China's actually growing a little slower than the 6%. But the slowdown in China is huge. It's huge, because what it's done is it's created part of the problem we're going to turn to next is the global drop-off in commodity demand. Where you see good growth is in India. I was talking with a fellow last night. India is growing fast, but its overall demand for softwoods and hardwoods is growing a little, but it's still way below China in terms of use of fiber and wood product. And I did want to remind you, I am a Chinese expert. I was telling Tim last night, I've been to China twice. This is, my wife and I took a trip to China in 2012, and we were on the Great Wall. We did a nice trip down we did a river cruise and spent some time in Beijing and Shanghai. 1987. The contrast between 2012 and 1987 was huge. This is what Beijing looked like in 1987. I was staying at the hotel a few blocks from Tiananmen Square, and all there were on roads in 1987 were bicycles. We also got lost trying to find the Great Wall of China because there were no signs. I'm not kidding. We got lost finding the Great Wall of China. I said to the guy, you can see this from outer space and you guys can't find the Great Wall of China. It had just opened up. And then when we were in Shanghai, when we walked along Bund, you were walking on sidewalks with buses almost driving on top of you now, and of course all these little other things. Now when you go to Bund, it's this very well developed, beautiful buildings, and when you look over Pudong, there was nothing there 25 years ago. Now you look across and there's all these high-rise buildings over in Pudong. What's amazing to me is China's changed huge in 25 years, but what's amazing is I didn't change at all. So this was probably the more amazing part. Because I did get to the Great Wall of China. My wife looked at this picture, and the only question she had, where did you get those shorts? So, China, coming back to China, one of the key factors that affects both softwood and hardwoods is construction. And I'll show you in a minute. A big part of where our wood goes is in concrete form. They're not building houses the way we build it. They use lumber primarily for concrete form. Construction is plunging. There's all these signs of an overbuild and a plunge in construction activity in China that could be dropping even faster than this. And yet, we'll see in a minute, overall demand has not changed much. When you look at usage for our products in China, it's primarily concrete form and some interior work. Interior work there is basically laying the little spacing on the floors or trimming out the walls to hang sheetrock and some other interiors. Also a lot of usage, when talking to my friend from Northwest Hardwoods, a lot of usage goes into the furniture business, and it's not for re-export anymore. The Chinese are using it for their own domestic furniture consumption, which is growing. Now, the slowdown in China is affecting not just our demand, but oil prices, some of you noticed, have dropped off a bit. And a large part of that's because global demand has been weak, but also the rapid growth in U.S. oil production. I mean, our oil production in the United States ramped up almost on a parallel with what happened in Saudi Arabia. A lot of people have been seeing the huge ramp up in our oil production. But the world supply, we're still awash in oil. Oil prices are down significantly, but other commodity prices have fallen as well. So what's happened for countries that are export dependent, particularly export dependent on things like oil or commodities, their exchange rates have fallen dramatically. Now, what you might notice here is a lot of these are exchange rates that are important to us if you happen to be in the wood products industry, because who are some of our major competitors in some of these offshore markets? The Russians, as a large forest owner with the largest supply. Brazil, if you happen to be in things like the uncoated free sheet business, the rapid growth in hardwood plantations in Brazil have made that the largest producer of uncoated free sheet, so that's a big driver there. And then you get into the other softwood areas. Chile, they're a big plywood producer, but also have large radiata pine. You have Australia, you have New Zealand dollar, which is huge because of what happens to their log exports. But it's also important to remember even the euro being off 20% is a big issue from our point of view, because FEA, when we used to talk about the coming shortage of softwood in the United States when we had a housing recovery, if we get a housing recovery, was one way we were going to feed our shortage of lumber demand was out of Europe. But basically to get European softwood lumber in the United States at the exchange rate we had 4 years ago, we would have taken about $500 a thousand. Today, the Europeans can import to the United States competitively at about $400. So a 20% drop in the exchange rate is huge. And if you look at what's happened to us as a result of it, you can see that, for instance, here's what's happened in the China lumber market. China's overall import of lumber, as you can see, ramped up significantly since 2008. Part of it is because they're trying to protect their own forests. It might be something, Tom, like we were talking about for us, the Chinese also want to maintain what forest space left they have, so they would almost prefer to import wood from someplace else. So their imports have ramped up. The bottom are the imports from Canada. The two major importers are the Canadians and the Russians. And you can see that the Canadian shipments are still very high, but they're falling. But they're not losing just to the Russians, though. If you take little bits and pieces, also the Europeans are starting to nibble bits and pieces into that Chinese market as well. So you're seeing little increases, and of course there's a little bit out of New Zealand. The problem, or one of the headwinds we're going to face in the international market, is exchange rates aren't going to get any better for us anytime soon. Because, I mean, with the world economy remaining slow, commodity prices remaining low, there's no sign oil prices are trend. By the way, I forgot one other major currency on there. That happened to be the Canadian dollar, which the Canadians are highly dependent on oil prices, and so the oil, I mean, there was a time when the Canadian dollar was as low as about 65 cents, then we got up to parity. Back when the Canadian dollar was 65 cents, I used to call it the Northern Peso, but the Canadians didn't find that very funny. But the parity, of course, from the Canadian point of view, that makes it very difficult. Now we're back to a significantly weaker Canadian dollar, which of course puts downward pressure on the price they import to the United States, puts downward pressure on product prices and timber prices as well. So with that, it's not likely to change. We basically see our interest rates going up, whereas your other central banks are going to remain. What I did want to do, and I just used this at an FEA conference, just so you can see what an exchange rate does from different points of view, I had to do this. So sometimes Americans, some of us don't deal with exchange rates routinely. The Europeans always have a hard time with Americans not understanding what exchange rates do very well. But it's important to see, this is what happened to log prices as seen in US dollar. Okay, back in 2014-15, hemlock log prices were up around $170 per cubic meter. This is in a China port, and basically this was a period when people in the western United States were trying to ship as much hemlock log out as they could, because they were getting about $150 per thousand premium over domestic equivalents. Today, on a hemlock log, you're not getting a significant premium over domestic, not enough to handle a lot of the other issues you have to do with log exports. And part of the problem is, if you look at a Russian larch log, it went from roughly the same price. Remember, hemlock competes pretty much with radiata and larch in that China market. And if you think of log exports off the west coast, you think of hemlock going to China, and you think of Douglas fir going to Japan. Japan tends to pay the premium for the Douglas fir species. But if you look at the hemlock, if you look at the log prices for a Russian larch, they've gone from about 160 down to about 100, maybe back up to 110. But this is what a price looks like from a Russian point of view. This is the Russian price in rubles. So if you're looking at the log price from a Russian point of view, their prices are doing very well into China, and they're still doing very well. That's what a 50% drop in an exchange rate does. And it significantly alters the whole pricing structure. We'll come back to it in a minute, because you might ask, why isn't China going to take the entire, or why isn't Russia going to take the entire Chinese market? And I'll show you in a minute why they're not. They still require wood from other sources other than Russia, other than the fact that sometimes the Russians can be interesting to deal with. Okay. Let me put it that way. Just as a sidelight, the 5 people that we dealt with on the Vladivostok, of the 6 people we dealt with on the Vladivostok deals, 5 of them were assassinated over time. So it's a different business climate in Russia. Just a little different business climate than the United States. I was going to say, part of the problem for the Russians is, of course, corruption and the infrastructure and a variety of other issues. Now let's turn to the competitive position of the U.S. South. Now, the U.S. South is really sitting in a unique and interesting position. Because of the drop in overall demand for wood products and lumber production, the inventory of timber in the U.S. South has been growing dramatically. And this was, I think, as Tom was mentioning, the unique characteristics, because the U.S. South, the forest grows so rapidly, so dramatically. If your harvest level falls off significantly, the inventory of standing timber grows very rapidly. In fact, there are some places where it grows so fast that the sawmills aren't even properly sized for some of the diameters that start coming in if you don't harvest those trees at the right age. But the growth in the inventory is huge, and it's going to continue to grow. What you're seeing is right now, the harvest levels for saw timber in the South have dropped below the annual growth. And And basically, we've added over 1 year of extra inventory of timber in the South. And we'll come back to this in a minute because you'll see it in prices. So the South has a lot of room to expand, and it probably needs to keep looking at markets other than just the United States. In the West Coast, there's a very different picture. The U.S. in the West Coast, harvest levels ramped up very rapidly, in large part because of log exports. What you'll see here is, again, this is kind of a complicated chart. Most of the harvest in the West goes to the green bar, which is lumber, and then there's a little bit that goes into plywood, and then there's log exports. But what's interesting is back in 2005 and 6, log exports were only about, and the scale on the right is the share of logs that go export, only about 5 or 6% of the logs harvested in the West went export. In 2011, 28% of the logs harvested in the West went export. 28%. And of course, we'll come back to it in a minute. You'll see the difference between what happened to log prices in the West versus the South. The West-South log prices ramped up very quickly. The South, they haven't hardly moved. The main message off this chart is primarily because the ramp up in harvest for export is the West has not been building saw timber inventory. And by the way, the West also has a hardwood inventory. I've been doing a couple of consulting projects recently with people who want to know what's the hardwood inventory in the Northwest. As you know, Northwest hardwoods tend to harvest alder and produce hardwood lumber out of that. But in the Northwest, we didn't like hardwood. So what you did in the West is we tended to exterminate alder if you were banning the plantation because it reduced the annual growth of Douglas fir. So one of the problems that the hardwood lumber industry in the West is now facing is the recent drop-off in harvest part of why they're not getting hardwood logs, or is it because there's just the trend of inventory of hardwood supply is declining in the West? Unlike the South, that still has a very abundant hardwood inventory, this West has a very limited hardwood inventory. British Columbia, as most of you have known, I don't know, have any of you had the opportunity to travel up in British Columbia, up towards Banff or any of those areas? Have you, any of you been up there and seen the beetle kill damage? Any of you had the opportunity? It's just mind-boggling, the amount of timber that has been destroyed and killed by the beetle. Because you'll be driving along and all you'll see is just hillside after hillside of dead trees. The inventory, the trees are getting, this started years ago, the inventory of trees that's available for harvest is dropping rapidly. One of the big sea changes in this case is that the Canadian capacity to produce lumber is dropping. Their ability to meet this international demand is dropping. And in fact, they will probably have problems. We think that the effects of the beetle kill will be almost on a parallel with the spotted owl event that happened in the Northwest when we took huge chunks of timber out of production in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1990s to protect the beetle for the spotted owl. But that's kind of what's happening, and a lot of the saw timber capacity sits in the devastated areas in Canada. So Canada is pretty much coming out of play as a major supplier for lumber and softwood over the next decade. So that brings us back to the U.S. South. Now, the U.S. South produced about 6-7 billion board feet back in, or produced close to 20 billion back in 2005 and 6. They were still running below that level currently, which is interesting to me, and we'll come back to why that's going to change quickly, is that the South is ramping up. The South sits in a fairly good position for the U.S. markets, also with where we sit, they should be doing fairly well internationally as well. But the U.S. South is going to go back and exceed previous peaks. And one of the reasons why, as I mentioned earlier, here's the difference between what's happened to timber values in the Northwest and the South. In the Northwest, Douglas fir, which is the green, the Douglas fir logs got back to over $600 per thousand, which is back to where they were in 2005. Hemlock logs, as you can see, because of the China effect, are actually running above where they were in 2005. And you contrast that with the U.S. South. The U.S. South basically has seen almost no improvement in saw timber prices in this cycle. And that's despite the fact that southern yellow pine lumber prices are back to where they were in 2005. So guess what? U.S. southern sawmills are making very good profit margins right now. It's an extremely good place to be in the sawmilling businesses in the U.S. South. And in fact, as a result of that, This slide is out of date, by the way. When the fellow at FE that tracks this put it together, there were 18 greenfield mills, restarts, and expansions announced for the South. There are now 18. So just since this slide was done, there have been 3 more announcements. That would include another announcement by Weyerhaeuser at Millport for a major expansion of the sawmill at Millport. And of course, there's the Canadians. One of the other big sea changes is the ownership of the U.S. South. This is what will make the softwood lumber agreement fairly interesting, is because there are three or four major, I know 3 of major Canadian suppliers now have major positions in operations in the U.S. South. That would be Centerfor and some others, Interfor and others that have large holdings of mills, particularly Georgia and some other states. But the fact is, a big change in both the expansion in the South and who owns it. On the pulpwood side, the South also has a significant, has made a pretty high harvest. As Tom was mentioning, most of your pulpwood is still used for things like pulp. As I said, the pulp that goes in on the softwood side is for containerboard packaging. What's used on the hardwood side is primarily for papers. The hardwood, and as you can see, bioenergy, which is that little thing on the top there, still, although it's a fairly rapid growth, and you see that on this next chart, the growth in the pellet production, which is for export primarily to Europe because of mandates on using wood pellets in the energy system, has been growing rapidly. But in terms of the use of the forest itself, it's relatively small. One of the primary threats for the U.S. South and for the pulp and paper industry is white papers and newsprint. So the demand for the pulp side on the hardwood side is probably going to decline. I did make some, I was corrected by Tim because I mentioned that there was a fairly good inventory to grow based on pulpwood, and he mentions that's not true for South Carolina. Currently, South Carolina has a more difficult position than other parts of the South in terms of the overall pulpwood. I don't know where the harvest in South Carolina sits to this overall number. I'm not that familiar with each of the regions, but fairly significant volumes going into there. In terms of the containerboard packaging, as you can see, this is basically what's going on the white side versus the dark side. Paper consumption is the blue line is going down. One other thing is not only has been the substitution from the South American and others that can use the hardwoods to produce pulp, but the change in electronics, and people just don't read the way they used to in the electronic substitution for paper usage. That's not happening on the brown side. As I said, Amazon and all this delivery that's happening for packaged goods from Amazon is just driving up containerboard packaging demand even more, and then you add in the demand for Asia, so the brown side still looks good. Probably one of the bigger sea changes has been the shift of OSB production in the U.S. South. One other little bit of my history, this shows how long I've been around. In 1980, I did the initial financials for Weyerhaeuser on the Grayling OSB plant. We wanted to grow an OSB plant. At the same time, one of the guys who was running the plywood business wanted to build a brand new plywood mill in South Carolina, or North Carolina, I don't know. He wanted to build a brand new plywood plant. We were having this debate as to whether we should build an OSB plant or we should build a plywood plant. And this guy, Tom, who eventually became the senior VP of OSB, he basically said OSB will never be successful in the market. It's too hard to nail, it's too hard to cut, it's too slick, it will never be successful in the market. Well, he proved to be wrong. OSB has been a very successful product, but technology's changed because in 1980, we were focused on North Central or Canada. The dominant production of OSB was up in the northern tier, and now the dominant production of OSB is in the U.S. South. You can see U.S. South in 2007 had about 7 billion square feet of capacity. By 2020, it's more than doubled. It'll be up close to 15 billion feet of capacity in the U.S. South. And given the relative logistics and the cost advantages and the technology have helped OSB in the South to grow to now be the dominant production region on OSB. So with that, let me come back to I'm still in good shape. That was nice of you, Tom, to leave me extra time. I had Tim worried that I would be, so yeah, I'll go along. So let's talk just a bit about, and come back, because I would like to leave a little time for question and answer, because I'm covering a lot. The international stuff is important. I think the issue when you start talking about domestic versus international, remember there's several headwinds that you're going to have to run into here. Is first of all, as I mentioned before, when you start talking about whether you do international events or not, you have to compare what am I going to make on an international event versus what do I make in my domestic market. And if it's easier to do it domestically, I tend to go that way for the short term. In the long term, though, you should still think about the fact that there are going to be some headwinds right now on the international side. The exchange rate's a big issue. The fact that the dollar is strong, the other currencies are weak, makes it hard for us. We are going to have a rebounding domestic market, and I'll come back to that now and focus on that. The other headwind, I think, is this growing protectionism. This reminds me a lot of what went on in the 1930s when we had all this protectionism come back because slow growth. Everybody seems to think if we protect our economy, that'll help us. It really doesn't quite work that way. If we protect us and they protect themselves, and global growth slows, and we all end up in a worse position. So we are finding another headwind, which is this pressure to stop free trade. But I do think, and I think as Tom was saying, I think the fact that you have broader markets, it enhances the value of the timber. You basically are looking at markets and uses that have unique advantage. Remember, southern yellow pine, not only is it stiffness, but southern yellow pine treats well. There are certain woods that other species don't treat as well as southern yellow pine. So you're not only direct exports that you've got treatable materials and other, and as I said, international also allows you to broaden the market opportunities so you won't be so dependent, because there will be another downturn in the U.S. market eventually. And when you look at primary wood products exports, for instance, it's lumber. There's very little OSB, very little plywood. OSB doesn't go offshore too much, partly because other countries have the species and whatnot that they can make their own plywood or OSB. In terms of the domestic market, this is my, I did want to show you, this is my history in the industry. I joined Weyerhaeuser in 1973 when U.S. housing starts were 2.3 million and Japanese housing starts were about 2 million. It's been downhill ever since 1973. Actually, the size of cycles we went through, it's important to notice the full scale and depth of this last cycle. The previous major cycle in this industry back in 1980, that was when there are a few people in this room that can remember when interest rates got up to double digits and mortgages were up to 12–14% and housing starts went through the downturn in 2008. Well, the good news is as soon as the Federal Reserve eased, housing starts shot right back up. The problem in this particular cycle is when we got up to the boom period in 2005 and 6, with single-family housing starts up at 1.7 million units. Remember, it's really important single-family, not multifamily. Single-family uses about 5 times the wood that a multifamily unit does, so it's the key driver. The things that we accrued in the woods there, so to speak, the dead timber that was there, when once the fire was set, housing starts went from, and we were trying to tell our management about the coming downturn, and it turned out to be worse and more prolonged, because one of the problems now is not only was this deeper, no, she went from 1.7 million out of 400,000. I point out to people, this is not a recession. This is a depression. I mean, this is basically a drop in activity like we haven't seen since the 1930s in housing activity and underlying demand. And here we sit today with housing starts a little below 1.2 million units. I still firmly am convinced that underlying demographics and fundamentals are going to drive housing in the United States back to 1.5 million units. And this is one of the key things I learned at Weyerhaeuser to be successful in the forecasting business. Not to give a number and a date at the same time. I've been talking about 1.5 million for several years, and it keeps moving over the horizon like a mirage. the key message for you to understand, when we get back to 1.5 million housing starts, or housing gets back to that level, what it means for wood products is North American lumber demand out there pushes back to 70 billion board feet. In that kind of a world, the operating rate for the North American lumber industry is going to be about the same as it was in 2005. That's a very tight market because Canada's lost about 5 or 6 billion feet of lumber capacity from the previous peak. So this is about as tight as it was then. So, okay, fine. So in terms of where prices are going to go, this is what's happened to lumber prices. Back in 2009, Douglas fir lumber prices got to $160 per thousand. How many of you know what year we were at $160 per thousand prior to 2009? Any guesses? 1982 was the year we were at $160 per thousand. But remember, that was 1982 in nominal dollars. Adjusted for inflation, you have to go back to the 1930s to see lumber prices that low. This truly was a depression. Now, in terms of the recovery, most of it's to reflect cost. You can see lumber prices have been relatively flat. And as I said, southern yellow pine lumber prices are back to where they were in 2005. That hasn't been bid back to timber. So that's why those guys are making very good margin. The problem is the U.S. market recovers and prices escalate from current levels as margins come back even better for other producing regions. We believe that we'll scale back some of the exports because the domestic opportunities get a little better and you tend to then ration out. But the good news is that we will maintain higher level of export than we had before. The other good news is that China, Russia, as I mentioned earlier, Russia has been increasing its share on the lumber side, but it's been dropping log exports. Overall harvest levels in Russia have been relatively flat. Now I'll get to the last place where we should see some growth and improvement is exports of logs from the South. Log exports out of the South have been growing. They're not huge. Less than 2% of the harvest in the South goes to export, but we do think that's still an opportunity, especially with improvements of the Panama. And given your relative price of logs, the South should do better on the log export market. And there are these issues of phytosanitation and whatnot, but you have to do that in the West as well. But it's partly why some years go container to phytosanitize out of the South. In terms of export regions, the other advantage the South has, I want to put this one in just to remind you the range of ports you have in the South that go to export. Charleston sits there as a fairly major one, but Savannah and others are very large exporting facilities in the South. And finally, I think the unique position the U.S. South sits in the container port business says it plays an important role in the global world. So in terms of my final messages is basically, I think the challenges are there on the international market. That you will have to look more carefully, more selectively about where can you make the extra money, where are the unique properties of your product, or how do you meet the unique characteristics of that market. And make it profitable. But over the next 10 to 15 years, the world's requirement for fiber in a variety of forms grows, and the U.S. South is the only geography that has the full spectrum of resources that the world requires. The saw timber inventory in the South right now is very large. By the way, I have to stay with saw timber as much as the warehouse, but that's where we focus, was mainly saw timber. There were other producers that planted and managed pulpwood, but that was not our primary role. And if you look at the inventory, I modified this one, Tim, to say it allows for some growth, and maybe selectively across the South in terms of pellets and container board. Now we might have 1 or 2 minutes for a question, Tim.
We have 5 or 6 minutes for questions.
Okay.
We have Mike here.
So what questions do you guys have? Again, thank you again for having me down.